Hello, everyone. My name is Emmeline Gasky, and I will be your host today. Just getting my technology sorted so we can kick off now. Hello, I'm Emmeline Gasky from the Australian Services Union, and welcome to our exclusive ASU member briefing following last night's budget. Before we begin, I just want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting on all around Australia. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people and pay my heartfelt respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, today's meeting will be in three parts. The first, we will talk through the very exciting announcement around equal pay that was made last night. Then we'll go through some of the detail in the budget that will affect you and our sector. And then we'll have some time for questions. So it would be great if you could take the opportunity to introduce yourselves in the chat box, because we've got members from all across Australia joining us for this briefing today. And as we go through the session, you can also put your questions in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them either in the box or in our Q&A session later. Now, we had originally intended to just provide you with a line-by-line breakdown of last night's budget and its impact on community services, but I'm sure you will have heard by now that we had a very exciting development last night in relation to equal pay. So before I take you through the line-by-line of the detailed information for the different sectors, I'll introduce you to our New South Wales and ACT branch secretary, Natalie Lang, who's going to take us through the breaking news on equal pay. Natalie.
Thanks so much, Emmeline, and thank you everybody who's joining us today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm calling in today from our Redfern office, so I acknowledge that I am on Gadigal land and I pay my respects to the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, to elders past, present and emerging. So as everybody knows, back in 2010, we started our journey to achieve equal pay when we lodged our claim in the Fair Work Commission for an equal remuneration order. And it was by no means an easy battle. But in 2012, following 3 decisions of the Fair Work Commission, we finally won recognition that work in the community sector is undervalued and that it is undervalued on the basis of gender. And we won equal pay. We won wage increases of between 23 and 45% for the now 200,000 workers in the community and disability sector, a monumental achievement owned by ASU members, activists who fought to have that recognition that we so rightly deserve. When we won equal pay, we didn't just win the order, but we also won the funding to be able to pay workers their new equal pay rates. That was a huge undertaking. And what we saw was the establishment of a special fund that would quarantine that money to make sure that it was delivered to services to be passed on as wage increases. And as we've seen the phased in implementation of our equal pay rates over the last 8 years, that fund has continued to top up service funding. But that fund was due to run out and the government had absolutely no plan to ensure that services continue to receive the funding they need to keep equal pay for all workers. Indeed, we actually saw funding contracts being issued to many services that didn't include equal pay funding beyond 2020. We knew what would happen if we didn't win equal pay. We undertook economic research and we campaigned. We knew that not saving equal pay funding would result in at least 12,000 job losses across the community sector and up to $15,000 pay cuts. And we said, no, absolutely not. We demand equal pay. We fought for it. We are entitled to it. And we will fight to save jobs, to save services, and to save equal pay. And I just want to pay tribute to every single ASU member who has fought so hard over the last 2 years in the Save Equal Pay campaign, because the victory that we had last night is your victory. It did not rain pennies from heaven. Just as it did not rain pennies from heaven when we first won equal pay, it did not rain pennies from heaven last night to save equal pay. It was your hard work and activism and campaigning. So last night, in a budget which we know had a lot of nasties in amongst it, there was an absolute glimmer of great news for the community sector in saving equal pay. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like. Now, firstly, in our Save Equal Pay campaign over the preceding number of months, we have been successful in getting most state and territory governments to commit to continuing equal pay funding for state government services. Hurrah, that's fantastic. We were also able to convince the federal government and the National Disability Insurance Agency, the NDIA, to save equal pay for NDIS services. Hurrah, that's fantastic. But the looming funding cliff for all federally funded and federal and state partnership funded services has continued to be rapidly approaching us. So what was included in the budget last night? Well, firstly, proper recognition of what we have been saying. Recognition that we are entitled to equal pay. Recognition that we would have a workforce crisis if we didn't win equal pay. Recognition that we would see a reduction in essential frontline services if we didn't save equal pay. And that has actually been spoken about in the statement that was put out by the Minister and Information for the Workforce. So congratulations to all ASU members for winning that important recognition. We saw millions of dollars of additional funding in the Department of Social Services funding package. Now, the way that this is going to be passed on is going to change from how it's been passed on over the last 8 years. So what will happen from July next year is, instead of services receiving supplementation funding to supplement them for increased wages of equal pay, services will now be what they've called rebased. That means equal pay and equal pay funding will now be rolled into the base funding for all community services. This is a great thing. This is definitely a better option than continuing a fund which could be taken away at any time. It means now your equal pay funding and your equal pay rates are secured in the base funding of your services. We have been told that that funding rebasing that's occurred in the Department of Social Services portfolio is to also occur in other departments which fund services that are pursuant to the Equal Remuneration Order. So we know those departments, for example, are the Department of Health, Department of Education, Department of Premiers and Cabinet, Department of Veteran Affairs, among others. So we have Attorney Generals, for example. So we will need to just make sure, as funding contracts are, quote, rebased, that the adequate amount of funding is being incorporated into those funding grants moving forward. So there is something for us to all do there, and that is to make contact with our funding bodies and ensure that our rebasing is occurring. If you have any problems with this, make sure you call the union immediately. Don't wait, don't hesitate. You deserve equal pay, and we will jump on this immediately. We knew 12,000 jobs were at risk. We will not be satisfied with just saving 11,999 jobs. We will save every single one of the 12,000 jobs that was at risk. Now, the part that's outstanding are partnerships. So those services that are funded by partnership arrangements. So what a partnership arrangement is where the federal government funds half of the service area and the state or territory government funds the other half. And what happens is the federal government provide their half of funding to the state then match that and administer that funding contract. So the biggest area that would fall into this category are our homelessness services, who are funded through the homelessness partnership funding arrangements. Now, it is not clear in the budget that the government has put aside the money for those partnership, to top up that partnership funding on the federal government's behalf. But what they have said in the budget papers is that those funding areas are pursuant to negotiations that will now occur with the state governments. So remember, what we know is many state and territories already are committed to continuing equal pay. So we need to go back and confirm with our state ministers that they are continuing to be committed to topping up the equal pay funding for their share of partnership funding agreements. And we need to call upon them to take that position into the negotiations that they're about to kick off with the federal government, and demand that the federal government match that commitment to saving equal pay in partnership funding agreements. So it's an absolutely fantastic win. There is certainly a bit more work for us to do, but what we have seen is that when we all work together and when we campaign together, we can achieve truly remarkable things. Winning equal pay in 2012 was a truly monumental, historic victory for every single one of us and for our industry. Saving equal pay in 2020 is equally historic, is equally monumental. We're almost there, and we can absolutely finish it off together. So what do you need to do? What are the next steps? Well, first off, celebrate. It's something that we're not always fantastic at doing because we're looking for the hidden nasties and the devil in the detail. But just stop for a moment and remember, the government has recognised the principles that we've been campaigning around. You do deserve equal pay. Equal pay needs to be funded to be able to be passed on. Your work is essential and you are on the front line of our COVID response, and you are on the front line of service delivery to support our community's most vulnerable members. So celebrate that recognition, celebrate the victory of union members in achieving equal pay in the first place and in saving equal pay in 2020. Next, have a conversation in your workplace about making contact with your funding body to ensure that the rebasing, and I'm doing it in the inverted commas because it's the government's language, the rebasing of your funding grant adequately captures all of the equal pay funding that you need. If you are funded by a partnership agreement, so for example, homelessness services, make sure that you're talking to your state minister so that they are taking that position into their negotiations with the federal government. We've won it before, we've won it again, and we will continue to win it. And equal pay will not be at threat again when we have this historic victory. Equal pay will be enduring. It will live on. You have waited long enough for it. You have waited decades. And then even after winning it in 2012, you've waited a further 8 years. We will not accept a penny less than what we need, a penny less than what we deserve. We will not accept a single job cut. We will save the 12,000 jobs. We will stop the threat of up to $15,000 pay cuts, and we will do it together. So make sure that you do take this time to celebrate in your workplace. Ask your colleagues who've not yet joined the union to join you in union, because only when we stand together do we get justice. Only when we stand together do we get the recognition that we deserve, and can we save jobs, save our services, and save equal pay. Thanks, Emmeline.
Thank you, Natalie, and well done to all the ASU members who fought so hard for this very, very, very important win that we got last night. Now, the next part of today's session is me taking you through some of the detail that was in the budget last night. So the ASU had representatives in the budget lockup, and we've had our experts poring over the details since last night. So we can provide you with some of this information. Now, of course, this is all very complex and the devil will be in the detail. So we're going to give you as much information as we can give you today, but there might be things we have to continue to follow up and continue to provide members on information on. So as we're going through this, please feel free to raise any issues in the chat box. And if we can deal with them today, we will. Otherwise, we will take them away and provide you with answers. Now, the first thing I wanted to talk to you about was what was in the budget in relation to disability services. We're happy to report that the funding for the NDIS is guaranteed moving forward. And there's also increased funding for the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission and the NDIA. There's $800 million over 4 years in new money. $93 million over 4 years of that money will focus on the NDIS Commission increasing their oversight of providers. So we know that there has been some concern among our members that the Commission hasn't got the resources it needs to properly investigate the complaints it receives. So we hope that this additional funding will ensure that they're properly resourced to do that very important work. Unfortunately, there's absolutely no new money in or plan for better NDIS training in this year's budget. This is a real disappointment, as these are the jobs of the future. We know these jobs could provide new employment for job seekers during this economic crisis, but they are skilled jobs and we need funding for training if we're going to be able to take that opportunity. So we're very sad to report that that wasn't in this year's budget at all. We've looked into what was in the budget in relation to women's services and domestic violence. There's some additional funding in the budget for 1-800-RESPECT, which will be spread over 4 years. The trick with this one is that the amount that's available is not for publication, which is really concerning to us, as it shows a complete lack of transparency. But the government says the reason it's not for publication is because it's going to go to tender. Now, what we're concerned that that means is that they're going to be going to tender with private companies and profit-spinning providers. And as you ASU members well know, it's been a long-held position of the ASU that these very important services should not be provided by private profit spinners, and there should be no profit from rape. So this will be one that we continue to watch and pursue. The next thing that we noticed in the budget was that there is $150 million as a one-off payment for DEV services during the COVID pandemic. So this is $130 million distributed to the states and then $20 million for a national awareness campaign. We looked into paid parental leave. There's an alternative test that they've announced in relation to parents whose job has been impacted by COVID-19. So instead of the previous test, which is that you have to have worked 10 out of the 13 prior months, you will have to have worked 10 of the previous 20 months for any births that are up to March 2021. So we hope that means that people who might have otherwise missed out because of COVID, job losses and job arrangements will be eligible for the paid parental leave. In terms of childcare, the government has extended the temporary support to Victoria until 2021. And the activity test remains lower for the rest of Australia until April 2021. However, beyond 2021, there's absolutely no improvements in access or affordability for childcare. You know, in this recovery, we're going to need to invest in helping people get back to work, and an absolutely critical part of that is accessible childcare, and the government absolutely turned its back on that as an option. We're also very disappointed that there is yet again absolutely no commitment to paid domestic violence leave from this government. And there's also no additional funding in this budget for specialist domestic violence housing to help women and children escape violence. So I think you can see it on your screen there that Sally McManus, the ACTU secretary, has summed it up pretty well in a tweet, that it seems women have been left out of the budget, even though they've been on the front lines fighting the pandemic. And I think that's borne out in the detail. In terms of housing and homelessness services, there's some interesting announcements in this regard that I'll go through in a little bit of detail now. So there's a plan for community housing providers to be able to borrow more money to provide more affordable housing themselves. But there's no actual increase in funding from the government for more construction or provision of social housing or homelessness services. So the government has also foreshadowed trials of social impact investments in homelessness and youth at risk of homelessness, which is about encouraging business to invest in homelessness with guaranteed profits. Now, we are very strongly of the view that there should not be any profit making in homelessness. So this is something that we're very concerned about. And there's also a complete and utter lack of detail in how this will be given to the states and how it would be piloted. So this is certainly one that we will be pursuing. We're also concerned to ensure that the partnership funding in homelessness is covered here from the federal government to cover the ERO. So that's one to watch. And, you know, instead of investing in new social housing or homelessness services, the government's priority is this $680 million for a home builder program for people who already own their own home to have renovations done. And we think that's just completely the wrong priority. Now, on mental health, there were some changes announced as well last night. The government announced that they will increase the number of Medicare subsidised sessions for counselling with a GP referral and a mental health plan from 10 to 20. And they also announced some one-off payments. There's a $46 million payment to Victorian mental health services for COVID response, and a one-off mental health bushfire recovery payment of $76 million. which is mainly for telehealth services in fire affected areas provided by organisations like Lifeline. There is an increase in headspace services from 124 to 153 services nationally. But there is no increase in funding to community mental health services or for those who are not eligible for the NDIS. And the transition money is ending and not continuing. So we're really disappointed to see here that the focus of the government is clearly on the medical model and telehealth instead of a community model and a social welfare approach. We looked into what was in the budget for Aboriginal services, and really there's no significant increases in Aboriginal services. The basic funding is maintained, including for Aboriginal legal services, and that does have in it the ERO or the equal pay component that has been budgeted for. There are also some smaller increases in Aboriginal mental health programs and family and domestic violence services, and for Indigenous Business Australia, which is for building housing for Aboriginal people in regional Australia. Larissa Baldwin's tweet is there on your screen, which again I think sums it up quite succinctly. There's nothing in this budget for Indigenous Australians. In fact, health funding has been cut. Now, we also looked into the aged care funding. The government announced a $2.2 billion increase in aged care funding, and this includes 23,000 additional home care packages, which is, you know, a great first step, but we have to bear in mind that the waiting list for people for those home care packages is currently 100,000. So while it's a good first step, it certainly doesn't go anywhere near far enough to fixing the crisis that we have in relation to home care. There's also funding to implement the Aged Care Royal Commission COVID recommendations that the government announced last week, which is mainly things around PPE and trained infection control officers for residential care. There's an extension of the aged care retention bonus, but there's just absolutely no detail on this as yet. We do know that the bonus does not apply to other frontline services working in COVID, like disability, youth, and family or homelessness. And there is $10.3 million in the budget for aged care workforce skills. And we just think that that is an insultingly small amount of money for workforce skills for this incredibly large and critical workforce. We also looked into migrant services, and the funding has been cut from settlement services across numerous departments, across social services, health and education. And this is because the government is assuming no settlement of refugees and migrants in Australia over the next couple of years. So the funding does seem to be moving from the settlement services to integration and employment services, like things like English language skills. So we are really concerned about this, and we think this is a big threat to jobs in migrant services. And so we will need to have urgent union meetings for our members in those services to work together on these the challenges that we face. So watch this space. We'll be in contact shortly. Employment services. So there were some changes in the budget to employment services, which we're concerned about. We're particularly concerned by the changes and what it means for our members who work in employment services, as well as the people they support. The government has proposed to transition to a new employment services model from July 2022, which means that job seekers will manage their own job search online with no face-to-face meetings with job search providers. So while it doesn't start until 2022, we really need to have local member meetings to talk to our members in employment services about what this means for you and your service and the people you support, and what we're going to do about it, because we do have some time to campaign on this and work together to save jobs and services. There's also, the government has put in $295 million over 4 years to develop and implement this digital system rather than directly into the services themselves, which is of some concern, especially at a time like this when there are so many people seeking employment. Nonetheless, this is one that we will work with you on, and we will mount a response to this challenge together. Now, we know our members are obviously very concerned about climate change, and I'm sure many members were disappointed last night that the government has chosen to shift its focus from prioritising transition to gas over renewables and other climate change mitigation policies. We've also looked into what was in the budget in relation to skills and training and how that impacts you in our sector. And unfortunately, the higher education package passed Parliament this week with the support of Centre Alliance. So it is now more expensive to go to university. There will be a 113% increase in humanities degrees and fewer subsidised places at university. Now, we were successful with the support of many ASU members in putting pressure on the government to create a social work professional pathway to make sure that the community services degrees weren't subject to a fee increase. And so before the bill passed Parliament, the government announced that there would be a social work professional pathway and they would not be subject to the same fee increases we're seeing elsewhere. However, this is one where we absolutely need to keep up our campaign, because it is completely unclear to what courses are in the pathway and what courses are not. And we want to make sure that all of the courses that workers in our critical sector undertake to perform the work that you perform is captured, to ensure that we have a strong pipeline of graduates coming so that we can meet community demand in the future. So we're going to pursue this and seek briefings from the department about what is included in the social work pathway, and we'll provide more information to members on that as soon as possible. Now, of course, it's also very disappointing that the focus of the skills money in the budget is on male-dominated industries and not the caring economy. And, you know, there is some conjecture about the government's new apprentices. They announced 100,000 new apprenticeships, but we have to look at that in context of 130,000 apprenticeships have been lost in previous budgets. So we haven't even made back the cuts the government has implemented over the last few years. And of course, we are really disappointed to see that there was no new money for skills or portable accredited training for community or disability services. Now, I know this will be an issue close to many of your hearts and mine too, and it was absolutely heartbreaking to see last night that there will be no extension of the COVID supplement to JobSeeker. There's also no commitment to lift unemployment benefits into the future, despite the budget forecasting record high unemployment for several years. We know this is going to cause immense hardship in our communities, and you know, we stand with our unemployed workers in their campaign for a permanent increase to JobSeeker. Finally, we looked into what was the changes for superannuation. Now, thankfully, some of the foreshadowed changes that we thought might have been in the budget, like cutting the increase to superannuation guarantee, weren't in last night's budget, which is not to say they won't be in the budget next year. But for now, we've avoided the very worst of what we thought might have been coming workers' way last night in relation to superannuation. However, the government is making it harder to join an industry super fund so that you could be locked into a private provider which you know, is making money off your retirement savings and offering you lower returns. But also, really importantly, is we know that there is a crisis, especially for women's superannuation outcomes, and we know what needs to be done about it. And instead of the government turning its mind to fixing the superannuation outcomes for women workers, it did absolutely nothing. So it's, you know, none of the changes that we have campaigned for many years to improve superannuation for women have been adopted. And so the superannuation gender gap will continue to grow and worsen. So this is one thing that we will need to maintain our campaign on to improve these outcomes going into next year's budget. But that is it from me in terms of this very detailed briefing, and thank you for bearing with me while we went through that. I think we might stop now and see if there are any questions that have popped up. Natalie, have you been monitoring the chat?
Yes, I've been monitoring the chat, and a few people have also sent them directly to me. So if you do have questions, please feel free to just pop them into the chat box. I've made some notes. So do you want me to go through those now, Emmeline? Not? Yes? Okay, excellent. So firstly, we were asked if we'll be able to provide links to the announcement about ERO funding that the government made yesterday. So we have put that now in the chat box so everybody can download that information statement that was issued by the government yesterday, which speaks to their principles about the intention of ongoing ERO funding and moving what was in the supplementation fund into the base now of all grants programs. The next question we were asked is, will we be making available the briefing about the detailed line-to-line budget analysis available following today? We have recorded today's session, so we will make that recording available. But I think what will also be useful, because the slides, of course, only had like a headline, and really, Emmeline, you've given us fantastic detail to each of those line items. So we will put together a briefing paper that will capture the discussion that's occurred today and the presentation that Emmeline has provided us all with, and send that around as well. Been asked in the box, what if my service is both state or federally funded? So that's a really fantastic question. So state governments have largely made announcements over the last few months about their intention around their services that they directly fund. Now, of course, it is possible for services to be funded either just by the state or just by the federal if they hold just grants from those two governments, but it's also possible for services to have, you know, that pot of money that's pulled together from multiple grant sources, which is really common right across the industry. So it will come down to each funding body. So really get in contact with your local union office and we can work through that with you. We know that, like I said, state governments have largely made those commitments, and we can work through with you the details there. Last night, the federal government made a commitment in relation to the grants that they directly fund. So that's a grant that they hold between the federal department and the service provider directly. The part that we're still working on are those partnership funding agreements. So it goes to the next question in the chat box, which was about the application to homelessness services. So it's not uncommon, this happens every single budget, that the federal government will go into negotiations with the state and territory governments about what the final funding package looks like, because it is partnership funding. And the federal government requires state governments to at least match the contribution that they're making. And that's what we end up as the final quantum of funds that's available for those partnership funding arrangements. Homelessness services are the largest partnership funding that would fall into that category. The federal government did not make explicit in the budget that they would be providing ongoing equal pay funding for their share of their national partnerships, but they also did not rule that out. What they have said on that matter is partnership funding is now going to be subject to negotiation with the states. So it's really important that what we do right now is get our advocacy skates on, get to our state ministers, our state housing and homelessness ministers, and say to them, we need them to, number one, make their commitment as the state minister to ongoing funding for their share of the funding arrangement. And number two, take that as their bargaining position to the federal government and tell the federal government that the federal government also need to continue equal pay funding in the new base for those national partnership funding agreements. And remember, what we're armed with is that statement, which is about the principles that the federal government are adopting around ongoing equal pay funding, recognition that it needs to happen. So work with your local ASU office and together we can do that advocacy. We can engage in that campaigning, and you, the members working in the frontline services, are going to be able to tell the most compelling stories about why we have to ensure equal pay funding is ongoing in those partnership funding agreements. We've also been asked, do the equal pay increases apply to new workers or workers who are not members of the union? Yes, it does. So what's happened here is what happens all the time. We're union members. When we win for everybody, and we really lift the base and we lift up the whole industry together. But that's not a reason why people shouldn't join the union. It's all the more reason why new workers should be talking to you. You should be going and approaching them and saying, great news, on the 1st of December, your pay is going to be increased because of a victory of union members. So we need to talk to new members, welcome them to the industry, make sure they're aware of where their pay increases are coming from, and ask them to join the union and stand with us. Because we don't yet have the equity and recognition that we deserve as frontline community workers. There are still many battles that we have going on about ensuring proper sustainable funding of services, career paths, training and development, supervision, managing workload, staff ratios, and we'll be able to achieve what we've achieved with equal pay on all those other issues if we have more workers standing with us together, because the bigger the union is, the stronger that we are together and the more that we can achieve. I've also had a couple of questions about specific federal funding grant programs that don't come out of the Department of Social Services portfolio. So for example, the National Indigenous Australians Agency funding. So this is where we need to be going to our funders and asking them to confirm directly how they will be, and their language was rebasing, how they will be rebasing your funding grant to include ongoing funding for the equal remuneration order. Again, it goes back to that principal statement that the federal government made yesterday, which is their intention is to continue equal pay funding, and it will be dealt with in each department, in each portfolio separately, directly into those funding grants. We've seen, for example, with community legal centres and with the Attorney General Department, that that equal pay funding is being included into contracts. Or announcements have been made. We've seen a specific line item last night coming into the Attorney General's Department over the next 3 years for continuing equal pay funding. So we need to have that explicit conversation with your funding body, whichever department you're in. So it's very clear for DSS. For the non-DSS funded services, you need to have that conversation with the funding body, and make sure you come back to the ASU and tell us how you got on. If you need any assistance, if they say no, then of course we'll absolutely fight, because like I've said from the beginning, when we win for everybody. We knew that the risk here was up to 12,000 job losses. We're not going to be satisfied with saving 11,999 jobs. We're going to fight to save every single job and make sure that the equal pay funding is properly factored into every single funding grant. But everyone, don't feel stressed about this, because this is how it has always been in the community sector. Every time we've won funding increases in the community sector, when we won equal pay the first time round, we've always then had to go through every single funding grant program and make sure that it's properly incorporated. There will be hiccups along the way, but together we're going to stand united and make sure that it's properly addressed. I think I've answered most of the questions there. Have any come in since I've been going through that and stopped following it? I can see that Angus and Tom have been answering questions as well in the chat box as we go. If you have any further questions, please contact your local ASU organisers or ASU office. This is a fantastic victory that we all should be celebrating, because it's ASU members who've won this. And remember what this means. Remember what it means for you as a worker to have pay equity, to have those wage increases of between 23 to 45%. And remember what it means for your service to be able to attract and retain skilled, experienced staff. Remember what it means for the people who rely on your essential frontline community services to be able to have that guaranteed continuity of service. Because together we will make sure that every single funding contract is appropriately updated to ensure ongoing equal pay funding. So make sure you keep in contact with us if there are any hiccups along the way. Emmeline, I'll hand back over to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to everyone for coming along today. I think that just about wraps up our post-budget briefing. And what we will do is get a detailed newsletter out to members shortly that goes through that detail that I took you through earlier in this session. Something that you can have a read and talk to your colleagues about. But before we finish up, I just want to remind you of the 4 things that we have to do coming out of today's meeting. The first is you have to celebrate, because the government would not have done this without your incredible campaigning. So go and enjoy it and celebrate it because you did this. But 2, show us the money. You need to get your service to check with the department that your program is funded through, is subject to the equal pay funding announcement. And if you've got any concerns, you contact your union organiser straight away and we'll follow it up, because we, as Natalie says, we're not going to be satisfied with the government saying they're going to do it. We're going to chase them down and we're going to ensure that they do it in every single service and for every single job. The third thing you need to do is work with your local branches to work with the state governments to put pressure on the federal government to those negotiations and make sure that those partnership funding agreements are subject to the equal pay increase as well. And finally, you need to get ready to celebrate on the 1st of December, because you've got another equal pay increase coming your way that you won before. And this time I think we've got even more reason to celebrate, because you'll be getting your pay increase and you'll be getting it knowing that your wage will be safe going into next year, and that the wages that you won all those years ago are secure. So bravo. Well done. We'll provide you more information about the details in the budget in due course, and we'll work with our members in those areas that we've highlighted we've got some concerns about. But that's all from us today. And so we're going to leave you with a short video to remind you of the fantastic work that all of you and your colleagues are doing on the front line. So thank you and see you soon.
Can swing, though nothing will keep us together.